Hi, everyone. We're just letting everybody in and giving people a chance to connect to their audio. And as soon as we've done that, we'll do the introduction. Thank you for coming. Okay, we're going to get started now. My name is Suzanne. My name is Suzanne DeGaetano. I'm the manager here at MaxBax, and we are so happy to welcome Brandy Schillace and Chris Johnston to our evening here tonight. I'm going to start with an introduction and then a couple of notes for how the evening will go. So Mr. Hummel and Dr. Butcher is Brandy's third book. And we partnered with the Cleveland Heights, University Heights Public Library to present Brandy's first book, Death's Summer Coat, What Death and Dying Can Tell Us About Life and Living. That was in 2016. And then year and a half after that, we worked with the Happy Dog and University Circle on the Case campus for Brandy's second book, Clockwork Futures. So we're thrilled to be part of this evening for Brandy's third book. Dr. Robert White was a towering international figure in medicine. And this really terrific biography and history is going to introduce or reintroduce him to the general public. Calling the book spirited and breezily provocative, the Washington Post wrote, White's unorthodox quest made national news several times over the course of his long career. But in Mr. Hummel and Dr. Butcher, Brandy Schillace finally gives it the thoughtful book-length treatment it deserves. Dr. Schillace is the 2018 winner of the Arthur P. Sloan Science Foundation Award and has appeared on Travel Channel's Mysteries at the Museum and NPR's Here and Now, which we listen to all the time, don't we? Her work has appeared in Scientific American, Globe and Mail, the Huffington Post, Slate, and Crime Reads. She is the editor-in-chief of BMJ's Medical Humanities Journal. Brandy is going to be in conversation with the versatile writer and journalist Christopher Johnston, who's published more than 3,000 articles in numerous journals and regional national publications, including American Theater, Christian Science Monitor, the Cleveland Plain Dealer, Cleveland Magazine, and Scientific American Online. Chris is the author of Shattering Silences, Strategies to Prevent Sexual Assault, Heal Survivors, and Bring Assailants to Justice. So before I turn it over to Brandy and Chris, just wanted to make sure everyone knows that they should be muted throughout the discussion. If you have any questions for Brandy, can you put those in the chat? Chris and Brandy will talk for about 40 minutes, and then we'll take questions from the chat. The program will last about 40 minutes, and then we'll take questions after that. So thank you all for being here. And wanted to say one other thing. The book is on our website. So if you don't live in Cleveland, or even if you do live in Cleveland, you can order it through our website. And in the comments section, you can say if you want Brandy to personalize it since she's in town. We have the great opportunity to have her sign it and personalize it for you. So thanks, everyone.
And thank you, Suzanne, the legendary proprietor of MaxBax paperbacks. Brandy, thank you for doing this. I have to say, first of all, congratulations on writing this wonderful book. I know it has a lot of work in it and a lot of time, and I appreciate all of that. And it's certainly made me want to read your other two books, so I'll check those out too. But I wanted to start by asking you, you mentioned in the author's note how you were introduced to Dr. White in terms of the Dr. DeGeorgia at Case Western Reserve gave you his a computational notebook, I think you say. And I just wanted to ask about that. How did that come about? Did Dr. DeGeorgia know him? Did he lead you to other sources? Did he kind of get you rolling past that meeting?
Hi, well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here, and I love doing events with MaxBax. Chris, it was a peculiar origin story. I will give you that. Essentially, if you are not familiar with Dr. White, I will describe this story to you in such a way that you'll get a sense of like my surprise. I am from Cleveland, but I moved here. I'm a Cleveland transplant, which is kind of a weird word to use in a book like this one. But I essentially hadn't really heard about Dr. White before, but I had run into Michael DeGiorgia, the surgeon here. He's a brain surgeon. And I had interviewed him for my book, Death Summer Coat, about brain death and brain trauma and things like that. He called me and said, I want you to come down to my office. I have something I want to show you. So I turn up and he pulls out this shoebox and he opens it up and he hands me, and actually he sort of pushes the shoebox in my direction. And I made some sort of joke like, oh, is there a brain in there? And I opened it up and it's this notebook, old notebook, computational notebook, the kind of thing you'd take to your labs in college. And I started flipping through it. It's got all this cramped writing, so much writing everywhere and pasted notes. And it says things like mouse brains. And I'm confused about what I'm looking at. And there's little bits of flecks, like gray, sort of rusty looking flecks. And I asked Dr. DeGiorgia, I was like, what is this? And he says, well, that's probably mouse blood. Those are from his mouse brain isolation experiments before he did the head transplant. So there's a lot of information coming at me all at one time there. And I said, well, head like transplant. He goes, oh yeah, the successful one that he did in 1970. And I thought, I don't know where to go with this. He had come into contact with it because of White's daughter, who kind of kept an archive. Patty kept an archive of a lot of his materials. And he asked me, hey, I think they're looking for somebody to do a sort of biographical look at his life and his work. So that was my initial sort of introduction to this unusual man. But what really came out of it is that as much as it's a biography, and it is, it's also this cross-sectional look at 50 years of time when transplant science and other kinds of scientific endeavors dealing with saving people's lives were just totally changing. And it was also taking place during the Civil Rights Movement and the Cold War and all of these other fascinating stories surrounding these experiments that he was doing that deeply affected him and affected the way he was received and the kinds of things he was capable of doing. So I feel like his life just opened up this huge window, not only on things that were happening in Cleveland, and it does that, but also things that are happening in the entire world.
So I'm curious about your initial research then. In the book, towards the end, you talk about the fact that some of his work was lost, like when they shut down the lab at Metro, and was there some significant amount of archival material left that you could use, or did you just do a lot of interviews with the family and doctors who knew him?
Well, if you mention Dr. White's name anywhere in Cleveland, everyone has something to say. I mean, what I found out is people will say things like, oh yeah, he was on that show, Big Chuck and Little John, or they'll say, oh, he saved my cousin, or he saved my niece. You get all of these people with information about him. He was almost sort of a local celebrity of sorts. So there were a lot of people to talk to. In addition, he published prolifically. So lots of articles, lots of often very dense and difficult to read articles about science and his experiments. But he also loved to write for the public. He had newspaper columns that he wrote. He gave lots and lots of interviews. So there was a really large body of work. The other thing that's true about him is his international and national reputation meant he had lots of friends and he had lots of enemies too. So you had two different sides kind of investigate the way people came away from Dr. White, like what they thought about him as a person. And I basically just immersed myself in all of it and kind of just powered through so many interviews and recordings and, reading his work and really diving in. A lot of the archival stuff that remains was in the hands of his children. So Patty White, Michael White, there were several of them that were kind enough to let me take a look at what was left. Sometimes it was just photographs. Sometimes it was bits and bobs of unpublished material that, or maybe first drafts of things that got published later. The lab had been deconstructed. Some of it had been housed elsewhere in storage, and I got to go take a look around just to get a sense of the atmosphere. really, but there's also films. There's film footage of the surgeries as they took place. So there's a lot of ways to really kind of, if you're looking for it and you're ready to spend 2 years kind of completely immersed in his life, I was able to really get a sense of who he was as a person, and also to take away from that a balanced perspective on the kinds of things that he did and what he was known for here in Cleveland, but also in Rome and in Russia and in lots of other places.
Yes. You were talking a little bit earlier about the history, and you're kind of encapsulating that 50 years when medicine and surgery made the leap to being able to do transplants, that he played a major role in multiple ways from what I read. But the other thing I really liked was you also put the whole thing into the larger historical context, starting with the resurrection men and the Frankenstein myth that he kind of had a little bit of fun with. So could you talk about that a little bit in terms of sort of the man's or human desire to keep people alive?
Absolutely. So, we all, I think, probably since human beings as a species were aware of their mortality, we've been looking for ways of extending life. And medicine is all about extending life. And that's really one of his deep desires, was to take part in something that was about life enhancing, life extending procedures. And for Dr. White, who's deeply Catholic, saving the life of the brain, saving the life of the mind was also tantamount to saving the soul. This is where he thought the human soul lived inside the human brain. And so there was, such a deep and abiding reason for him to want to extend the life of a human being, that it became the most important thing for him. And it also made it like he was very convinced that he was correct. He was on a God-driven mission, really, to save lives. And that also made him sometimes probably difficult to deal with, because he was very, very sure of himself. He rarely ever, if ever, doubted what he was doing. But life extension, this isn't new necessarily. You talk about resurrection, and so I started off, I'm actually a historian. Normally I look at sort of a further away past, where resurrection men were basically grave robbers. They were digging up bodies to be anatomized by science so that scientists and doctors could learn more about the body. And so there again, doing something that seems a little off-putting and yet has results that people like and want. So that's that. But there was also that fear that doctors were preying on people who couldn't protect their dead, right? Strangely enough, the history of transplant science has a similar kind of mythos surrounding it. The idea that you could take organs from one body and put them in another body, we think of as pretty like, sure, I'll mark the organ donor bit of my license, But it was something that was mind-boggling. We could not do it, and then we could, and that's such a strange thought. And I try to re-weird it, to remember what it would be like the first time you found out that a heart could be taken out of one person, put in another person, and they could live, is just a phenomenal idea. And it was because of these early successes that White began thinking about it, because he was at the Peter Bent Brigham when the first successful kidney transplant was done by Dr. Murray. And it was done on twins, because this is before anti-rejection drugs, so you had to work with identical twins to make this really work. And after it, White was like, why stop at kidneys? Why not transplant other organs? Why not transplant a whole body of organs, just all at one time, and save the life of somebody whose body is deteriorating, even though their mind is still sharp? And so that concept seems like science fiction, but at the time that White was coming up with it, organ transplant seemed like science fiction too. So suddenly you were able to do organ transplant. What might science be able to achieve in the future in terms of life extension?
And I think you also talk about the fact that it was during this Cold War period. And even though his driving focus was to save life and to improve life, but he also had that little bit of competition in there with the USSR. And he refers to it as there was the outer space race, with the USSR, but also this, he calls the inner space race. I thought that was really interesting too, that he was driven to try to be the first to do this and to accomplish these things, I think for the betterment of medicine and for human beings. But was there a little bit of kind of a little competitive edge to him?
Oh yeah. Oh
Yeah.
yeah. So Dr. White was a very competitive person, but his reason for being competitive wasn't for competition's sake, but he was certainly driven that way. And I have to put this in context. During the Cold War, there was a connection made between scientific discovery, scientific prowess, and ideology. So there was a real sense that if your science won, your ideology won too. So the space race wasn't just about who was getting to the moon first, it was about whose ideology was going to win, the Soviet ideology or the American ideology. And so, you know, White was being very patriotic in some ways by wanting to take part and to win this race. And this was driven in part by the fact that shortly after the successful kidney transplant that happened, a little bit of footage was released from the USSR. And in this footage, a physiologist, so not a surgeon, but a physiologist named Vladimir Demikov had shown off a surgically altered animal. And it was a large Mastiff dog that he had attached surgically a second head to this dog. And he was showing it licking up milk and perking up its ears and doing various things. And so suddenly, like, it was on, you know, like, well, if the Soviets can do it, then we can do it too. And if you want to think about it, the space race, similarly, you know, some things the Soviets, they put Sputnik up and we were like, oh no, we have to do something to chase that. Soviets put a dog in space, the Americans put a monkey in space. Soviets created a surgically two-headed dog. White thought, time to experiment with primates and see what we can do in that regard. And so something that I think we look at that and go, that's terribly macabre. Why would you want to do that? That's not the world that we were living in at that time. And so instead there was much more like, aha, we've got to do this. We're gonna figure this out and we're gonna win at it. And so, you know, he was part of that, but it was an entire aesthetic, it was a whole impetus for medicine at the time, that winning really, really meant something. And there was clear gains and losses to be had.
And it did seem like he was willing to collaborate kind of even up to the end. And I don't want to get too far ahead, but it looked like he was trying to do something in Russia at the end, even, or China, just to advance what he was doing. So I think there was collaboration throughout from your story. And
There absolutely was. I mean, one of the things that I enjoyed was that fairly early on that White had this competitive streak, but he didn't think, it's not that he thought of Vladimir Demikov as an enemy. He didn't. This was a colleague who's also working on things. Yeah. And when White runs into some roadblocks, he works on a brain isolation experiment. And that's hard to explain, but essentially we can all sort of picture a brain sort of disembodied, right? It's shaped like a walnut, it's kind of a big squishy bag. But when you start to think about how you get it out, and if you wanted to get it out and have it still be alive, that's a much more complicated situation. So White had been experimenting on isolating brains and having living brains outside of their bodies. He did it with mice and also with monkeys and tracked, you know, electrical impulses and things on EEG. But how do you prove that that brain's really still in there? How do you prove that there's real thought happening? So he decided that it might be worthwhile to go meet Vladimir Demikov and talk about what those early head transplants were like. But when he got to the Soviet Union, what he actually realized is that despite a lot of the bravado and the kind of marketing that he was seeing over here coming from the Soviet Union, the actual people who were working in really difficult conditions. The economy was in trouble. People were not doing well, and he had a real heart for that. And he ended up really liking the Russian people, and he writes about it extensively, how wonderful they were and how kind, and how he enjoyed being with them and enjoyed being there. And it takes him a long time to find Demikov. He'd actually fallen on particularly hard times. But he does find him, and he actually has like a lot of empathy for him as a person. And White ends up going back to Russia, especially Moscow, but other parts of the Soviet Union and after the fall to the former Soviet Union, repeatedly in his life, many different trips, and making lifelong friends, and even bringing some of them to see him in the United States as well. So sometimes those big fights are really between governments and not really between people.
And I also wanted to say, I thought you did a really wonderful job of communicating, writing about these very complex operations. You make it all very clear and concise, easily understandable to just a general reader. So obviously you have a lot of experience in that field, but I thought that was well done too, to understand all of these things with neuroscience and neurosurgeries and transplanting and all the things that you need to know.
It was complicated. I will say that I had a lot of people
Yeah.
to thank for that. Yeah, definitely. In fact, Michael DeGiorgia got a lot of questions from me over time. I was like, okay, I'm taking this concept, I'm trying to bring it, is it still correct? Like, did I translate this correctly or not? So many thanks to the people who worked with me over the period of writing this book.
I wanted to ask you too, because it is such an unusual topic in terms of what he was trying to accomplish, and seeing the photos of the two-headed dogs and all those things, and you even refer to it as the strangest story you've encountered. Was there anything in all of the work you did and photos that you saw, all those things, that was the strangest to you, or the most surprising, something that maybe you weren't expecting?
You might think that if someone's trying to perform a head transplant, the head transplant itself would be the most unusual thing. But it's not for me. I think for me, it's two things. One, it's the fact that you could isolate a brain, that a brain could outlive its body. I think we're all used to the concept of brain death. Even though I will admit, there's not actually a single super easy definition of what brain death is. There's a checklist, and some of it's sort of subjective, and you have to read EEGs and figure things out. And we have legal definitions to help us. But at the same time, we're familiar that brain death means, okay, you're gone, but the body might still be alive. And that's when organ donation often happens. It's a much stranger concept to think about a brain outliving its body. Living beyond body. And I think just the mere thought of that was really like, oh, I had just not thought about that. I had thought about the concept of brain death, because I've written a lot about death, guys. Like, I have a whole book on death. I'd never thought about what happens if my brain outlives everything else. So that was probably the strangest thing that I encountered. But part of that was he made that happen through a technique called perfusion. And this is basically it's therapeutic hypothermia. This is something he gets nominated for a Nobel Prize for later on. And that is very meaningful to me personally, because my dad had open heart surgery a week ago, and they can't do that well without these kinds of techniques, because perfusion, your brain's very greedy for oxygen, and if it doesn't get enough blood and oxygen, you suffer brain damage and can die. But if the brain is super cooled, it doesn't need as much. It's not as greedy. And so they can perform surgeries in ways we never used to be able to. They use it sometimes with cardiac arrest victims to preserve their brain function. They use it in other types of brain surgeries. So it's personally meaningful to me that something White himself, worked on and helped to promote, and even was recognized for, was used last week on my dad. So
Wow.
those are two things that mean a lot to me.
Yeah. Wow, that's great. Yeah, it seems, and you talk about this in the book in terms of the trying to get nominated or being nominated for the Nobel. It seems like that's the one thing he's remembered for that's completely positive, and there's no real controversy. It's helped so many people and changed medicine and really improved how they could work. I wanted to ask you too about him as a person. We can use all the adjectives: brilliant, complex, controversial, eccentric, anything, and they all fit for him. Was there anything that you learned about him that was maybe surprising or most interesting to you as him as a person?
He was a lot more philosophical in some ways than I think I expected. I don't know if you want to call him a sort of polymath kind of person, but he saw things in his head before he did these surgeries, almost in a three-dimensional kind of way. And even the apparatus that he developed for different surgeries, like he put that together in his mind. And I knew that about him, and I think that makes sense. I think brain surgeons have to be able to think 9 steps ahead, and they have to have the confidence to go inside and work on this incredibly delicate organ. But what surprised me was the way his religion, his philosophy, which is not quite the same thing, and his science all were just a perfect, wonderfully blended marriage. It's not that he saw them in opposition. And I think we often ourselves, we look and we go, religion is over here and science is over here, or practical application is here and philosophy is over here. In Dr. White, they're just all one thing, and they're all connected to the way he operated. And for him, saving the brain through surgeries, saving the brain, beyond body, or however else you wanted to look at it, that was all part of his deeply held beliefs about the soul, and that souls were worth preserving. And he felt that he was on sort of a God-directed mission to do that. In addition, he practically was doing things, but he also had this philosophical understanding, even in the way he talked about the way brains and souls would work together. And he called the soul fourth dimensional. At one point, he was describing a brain of somebody he had worked on who had perished. And he said, Joe, I had his brain in my hands. It was someone I knew. And what I had was the empty bottle because the perfume was gone. And the poetics of that, I just wasn't expecting that as well in this person who also is clearly mathematic and scientific and all of these other things. And so the title, Mr. Humble and Dr. Butcher, tries to get at the fact that he was a person that was very, very complicated and had different sides to his personality. And yet you can't put Dr. White in a box. I mean, there's times when he's absolutely angelic and heroic. There's times when he's kind of the anti-hero and, is doing things that you're like going, oh, but he's all of those things at one time. And isn't that a wonderful representation of humanity itself? Aren't we all really complicated, composite people, trying to exist in this world and get things done?
And he also, it seems like he was a very loving father and family man, and kind of almost a man of the people. At the end, he's meeting with people at McDonald's and giving them medical advice. And so he seemed to have multiple dimensions.
Absolutely. He was a family man. He had 10 children. And I've met some of them. I've been in contact with his granddaughter, who actually got in touch with me. She's doing neuroscience, I believe, and she got in touch with me after having read the book. And so, he had a deeply well-rounded life. His wife was amazing, by the way. I don't want to leave her out. I was astonished by this woman, Patricia, like 10 children. Their house on Shaker was described as like a 24-hour hotel and diner. Like it's just, children in and out. And someone got in contact with me who said that they were at a fraternity and they felt like their fraternity just lived at the White residence. Like everybody was just always there. And so you get the sense that he had this whole life, this whole experience that was separate from his work in medicine. And that was just as meaningful and important to him. He took the bus everywhere, Yeah. It's just a great story about him going to the West Side Market, or taking all his kids grocery shopping, or taking them all out to Sandusky, for vacations and things. And he had them all in like numbered t-shirts, and he'd yell at them like, "Number 2, you're too close to the water," or whatever. So it's a fantastic story about that. I was even asked not too long ago, someone said, "What do you think White's legacy is?" And I thought, well, there's a lot of things that you can say, but at least in Cleveland, his legacy is people. I mean, there's people walking around right now who just wouldn't be here. So it's a complicated tale. He certainly had plenty of enemies as well. I mean, animal rights activists were not keen at all on the kinds of things he was doing. And in fact, maybe they asked really good questions sometimes. They brought up good points. So I like that you can't put him in a box. You can't decide he's only one way. And I think that's fascinating stuff.
Yes. Yeah. And you really capture that in the book too, that he is this very complex character that had all these different dimensions and sides and interests, from the Vatican to playing baseball in their side yard. So just really, really rich character that you put together of him. And I thought that was one of the strengths of the book also, in addition to all the scientific information and conveying what he accomplished. And I also want to ask you, kind of related to all that, that his focus was so much on trying to accomplish this transplant of a head or transplant of a body. He referred to it in different ways. And he was not able to accomplish that with a human being. He did do it with the monkeys. But do you think, was he just sort of, pardon the pun, ahead of his time? Or did he really have this vision that he believed that at some point we'd be able to heal and regenerate the spine so that he could do those, or that medicine surgeons could do those procedures? Or did you feel like he was just seeing into the future?
You know what? That's a really interesting question, and it's one that I have thought a lot about, but there aren't easy answers to, not because there aren't answers, but because there's several answers to it. One thing I will say is his commitment to thinking about human head transplant was partly due to the fact that he really thought any human life where the brain still was active was worth saving. And I mention that because that was actually a bit ahead of its time, even now. I mean, I think now we understand ableism and disability rights and things like that. But at this time, when he first looked at performing a head transplants, and Craig Vidovitz basically volunteers to be his patient, Craig Vidovitz was already suffering from paralysis. He had been in a diving accident. He was tetraplegic. He could move his shoulders a tiny bit, but otherwise got around with a motorized chair with electric commands and things. And people would say, why do we want to, even if you could make this an easy surgery to perform, they will just be paralyzed, so why do it? But Craig Vidovitz's point was basically, my life is worth living. I'm paralyzed now. I'm paralyzed and I have a full life. I'm married, I have kids, I have my own business, I travel. Why is my life somehow not worth saving? And his point was, if you say that paralysis is somehow makes you less worth saving, then you're being ableist. This is long before we were having those kinds of conversations in the public. And so in that sense, I think he was ahead of his time almost philosophically, in the sense that any life is worth living. And he used Stephen Hawking as an example a lot of times, but this was also true anecdotally. I put several anecdotes in the book about lives that he saved, that he was like, this is still a life worth saving. It doesn't matter that you are paralyzed. Now, to the second part of your question, will we get to a point where we can regenerate the spinal cord? There's certainly people trying. There's some people who are working with something called polyethylene glycol, or PEG. I talk about that in the book. It's not able to regenerate the spinal cord, but they have been using it for injury sites and things like that. Some people are looking at stem cells. Probably the most interesting developments, I think, come out of BrainGate and other people who are trying to, quote unquote, close the loop or directly stimulate from brain to paralyzed limb, skipping the spinal cord, doing it electronically or in a computerized way. There's a lot going on there that, who knows? Science has changed so much in the past 5 years. Who knows what it'll be like 10 years from now, 50 years from now? Whether or not head transplants will ever be a thing, that I'm less certain about. For one thing, I think it's a complex, we're complex creatures, and I'm not sure that I just live in my brain. So if you are creating sort of these composite bodies, taking a body transplant and a head, I'm not sure where that leaves the person who has that done. It's difficult to say, because certainly I think we've learned so much about how our bodies and minds interact and relate to one another, the chemicals down to the genetic level, even the neurons in our gut, right? Those are neurons, right? Just like we have neurons in our brain. So sometimes you can do something when it doesn't mean that you should do something. And I will give a quote that Dr. White himself said when someone asked him, well, even if we can do this, what makes you so sure that it should be done? And his point basically that he said was, that's for bioethicists to decide. I'm merely the humble surgeon. I'm Mr. Humble, right? I'm just performing, and really we need to be told whether or not things should happen.
And you talked about this a little bit too, in terms of PETA and the battle that went on there not just with Dr. White, but throughout medical science, different hospitals, Maryland Research Center, and so forth. Did you present a very balanced look at that and what the arguments were and how they felt about the work each side, but did you fall down on one side or the other? Did you understand like what they were saying about treating animals that way? And
that, you know what, I was fascinated by that story, and for the readers, part of the book actually goes back and talks about what happened in Silver Springs, Maryland. And that's the Silver Springs 13. There was a group of monkeys, and that was the first intervention of PETA, and essentially kind of launched PETA. That wasn't Dr. White's lab, it was another person's lab, but essentially they went in and they said, animals deserve to be treated better than this. They were in small cages. And some people have asked me, was Dr. White violating animal rights? And in fact, at the time he was following the laws very, very carefully. It's just that the laws have changed a lot. So these days we have much, much more careful treatment of experimental animals. Once upon a time, animals didn't really get enrichment. Now there's almost like zoo-like enclosures, even for experimental primates, so that they're treated with, they have as full of a life as you can have as a lab animal. And that didn't used to be the case. So one of the things I took away from the research wasn't necessarily a for or against argument about animal experimentation, so much as, the fact that that debate happened actually gave us a better situation than we originally had. Turning the spotlight on laboratory treatment so that the public understood things, it changed our minds, and we thought, okay, something needs to be done. So laws were passed that might not have been passed otherwise. And at the same time, scientific pushback saying, we still need to be able to do these surgeries because it's helping us save lives, it's helping us develop surgeries, it's helping us develop vaccines, et cetera, meant that you ended up with kind of a balance. It's almost a checks and balances, I think. So no, I didn't end up really falling down on one side or the other so much as realizing just how valuable and important both of those arguments are, and that these two sides working together to try and find better solutions was really important. I actually, I interviewed Ingrid Newkirk, who is the founder of PETA, for the book, and I was fascinated by the things she had to say. She debated Dr. White right here in Cleveland at the City Club of Cleveland, and that was fascinating. I saw it, it was filmed. And, both of them, they both made points. They were rhetorically interesting. And again, just like Dr. White wasn't the enemy of Vladimir Demikov, he wasn't the enemy of Ingrid Newkirk either. They talked to each other in a civil way. Ingrid feels very, very strongly that what he was doing was wrong, and she still thinks that. And White felt very strongly that what he was doing was right. And he died thinking that. So sometimes there's an impasse, but I still think both of those sides turned out to be incredibly valuable for where we are today in terms of our bioethics and our animal ethics.
And from what I know of you and from reading the book, it seems like you were the absolute best person to write this book. Were there other challenges or other highlights, things that you encountered along the way that stand out for you, memories that you have?
Gosh, I will say that I tend to be somewhat difficult to shock. I worked for the District Medical History Center and Museum down on Case Western's campus for a number of years.
Yes.
And while I was there, I saw a lot of things. I researched a lot of things. You don't spend all day around bone saws and apparatus for removing stuff from bodies without kind of developing a thick skin. So I wasn't shocked by anything, but I will say that, trying to figure out a way to communicate a surgery or surgical technique, which is quite visceral and potentially upsetting and endlessly complicated, in a way that could be accessible. That was really, really the hardest thing, I think. And I spent probably more hours sitting down and trying to figure out how to communicate and translate that information to a wide public audience than I did in any other part of the book. Because, White himself was such a character that narrative-wise, he was just fun to follow around and see what he was getting into. But that was difficult. The translation of surgery was difficult. Probably the only other hurdle I ran into is I ended up going to Moscow to research the book, because a lot of the information I found out about what was happening in the Soviet Union was really conflicting. Like, I couldn't find things to agree. So I thought I just better go there and ask people who were there. So that's what I did.
Oh, that's a great trip. So does the district have anything of Dr. White's or any of his?
I don't know. I don't think so. I didn't encounter anything while I was there. I don't know if they've acquired anything since. But then again, I started the project after I left, so it's hard to know for sure. Yeah.
Not curious if he had a relationship with them at all, but
yeah.
I
know that there's at least a couple of episodes of Big Chuck and Little John that he's on.
I'm trying to picture that as I read that, and I used to watch the show, but I never saw those. And I'm just trying to picture Dr. White with those two guys.
He was a member. He was actually really close friends with John Rinaldi. So it was they hung out. It was great. They did a lot together, actually. I think some of the photos in the book show they had kind of a sort of secret Santa thing. They would go and deliver toys around Christmas time and all sorts of things that they got into together.
So yeah, again, just another part of his very interesting world that he lived in and things that he was interested in. So tell us a little bit more about, you're working on some new things. You have some new projects related to the book, or are there things that came out of this whole experience for you?
Yeah, I never don't have a project. But I am actually, I just finished writing an article that'll appear with Undark, MIT's publication, which looks a little bit more at the at early transplant science and the kind of civil rights racial tensions that were happening at the time surrounding that. So I have one about that that is coming out. I started working on a pitch for the Globe and Mail, specifically thinking about what does it mean to be a brain beyond body, because I just that just is kind of mind-blowing. There wasn't really room necessarily for that in the book. So I have some of those things going on. I think from here, I'm really interested in this concept of that you asked about earlier about preserving life, because I feel, I mean, granted, I started off, my very first book ever was an academic book, and it was looking a lot at birth. My first major book that I did was looking at death. And I've been interested in life extension ever since. So I'm curious to know, what does it mean to extend life, and what kind of ethics are involved? Because sometimes we get to the can a lot sooner than we get to the should. And in fact, what lives matter? You know, whose lives matter? Which lives are worth extending, and why? One of the criticisms of body transplant, full body transplant, was if I die, and I am an organ donor, if I die, my heart could go to somebody, and my lungs could go to somebody, and my liver could go to someone else, and all of these other things. But if you're going to take the entire package and give it to one person, then are you basically saying their life is worth 5 other lives? And so again, it's not so much that I think these are, this is not a terrible thing, but these are questions we should ask, and we tend not to always ask them. And an even better question is, who gets to make those decisions? Like, who have we given that power to? Because we don't want to abdicate power on ethics. Like, we really want to be we as the public, as human beings, we want to engage with those questions and make sure that we ourselves are asking the hard questions, and not just being happy with the solutions, but also willing to go back and go, how did we get here? You know, what's the systemic problems involved here? You know, we know we have systemic problems with racism and sexism and all sorts of other things. And so how do we make sure that the end result hasn't committed a lot of terrible things along the way to get there? That requires all of us to ask those hard questions. So I'm sort of in that vein. I'll probably keep going in that direction.
Got it. I just wanted to ask you one more thing. I know we have some people who have questions for you. Well, I'm just trying to remember from the book. It seemed like he was trying very hard to try the human transplant, and it just didn't work out. It was too expensive. People wouldn't really support him, and he did try in Soviet Union and China. Do you think he felt good with his legacy at the end? Do you think he was satisfied with what he had accomplished from what you know? I'm asking you to
sure.
Where do you think he was?
I think that Dr. White really saw most of his success in terms of the surgeries that he had successfully performed on people. And so I think he felt like he was quite a successful person. He really was excited to be nominated for a Nobel Prize. Unfortunately, he died the same year he was nominated. And so we'll never actually know how close he was in the running because it's never delivered posthumously. Right. So I think if he had managed to win the Nobel Prize, he would have felt like that was like, the icing on the cake at the end. But no, I believe Dr. White, it seemed to me from everything that I encountered that he felt quite successful, that he had spent his life saving lives. And I realize that he's a complicated figure and that not everybody looks at his work in the same way. And I certainly try to present a really balanced view of that. Certainly animal rights activists don't see him in the same light that he saw himself. But for Dr. White, the fact that lives were saved was, I think, the most important thing about what he did as a person.
Yeah, I certainly felt like that book was necessary. It just, articles had been written about him and people knew about him, but after his death, he kind of faded a little bit. And I really am glad that you wrote the biography so that that's there for people to learn about his work and who he was.
Thank
and the
you.
impact he had on the field. So.
Well, I think too, the fact, I just want to drive this home because it's a Cleveland story. It really is. And Cleveland is a remarkable town. I love Cleveland. I love living here. And one of the reasons he came to Cleveland, I think is really an interesting story and it's important. One of the reasons he came here is he didn't just want to be a neurosurgeon or a neuroscientist, right? He had these two drives and he wanted to be both. And Cleveland was the only place that he received an offer that said, we're happy for you to do both things. We're not going to put you in a box. So, that makes me feel good. I'm like, yeah, that's a Cleveland thing. We don't want to be in boxes. So, he was able to do work here that he wouldn't have been able to do anywhere else. And there's so many people from Cleveland in this story too. His wife, Patricia, she was head of the fan club for the Cleveland Indians, or the former Cleveland Indians. And, there was so many things that the family was part of. Right here, I found out that apparently he won Irishman of the Year. He's not Irish, but he won like Irishman of the Year at one point. Just peculiar things like that just bring home that sense of, Cleveland and pierogies and pretzels and beer. Like, yes, Cleveland. It's in that book, and I hope people from Cleveland see themselves mirrored in the kinds of things I get to talk about.
And there's definitely a foundation here for medical innovation. We're recognized as a medical center around the world, and so I think he came to the right place. He was in a good setting for his work to be in Cleveland. So,
Chris, I can ask some questions from the chat now.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't know if you had some or.
Yeah. So there's a couple questions and a comment. First of all, Patty wanted to say, how much she and the family liked the book, and also thank you for mentioning her mom. And then we had a question. In the age of CRISPR, would Dr. White have gone as far as Chinese scientists in altering embryo genes and with no approval? And then as a second part of that same question, for the monkey brain transplant, was it with or without institutional approval?
Got it. So the first part of your question, next book, you have to wait. CRISPR technology is endlessly complicated. There's the Gene and Intimate History by, I think it's Mukherjee, is a really interesting book if you want to like dive into that, but I'm sure you can get it from Max Beck. But basically CRISPR technology, genes are just crazy. They're crazy complicated. There's so much complexity. And really that would be a different branch of science. So White wouldn't have necessarily had a chance to be engaged in that side of things. I do think that you see in a lot of the questions surrounding gene research and what genes are capable of doing and what they're not, and stem cell research as well, which is also separate from the CRISPR stuff, there are people asking the same, can we extend life? Can we preserve life questions? There's no doubt about that. That is definitely something that's happening. But it's definitely quite different from the very almost manual analog way in which White was attempting to do things. The other thing about gene editing is it tends to happen embryonically. And so that's, again, a different field. I will say something that I think is very interesting, though, and so I apologize for going on a slight tangent, but I think it's a useful way of looking at your question, which is the Chinese scientist who he edited the genes without permission. At first, everybody in his home country was like, yay, awesome, look at this fantastic thing. Then when there was backlash, he ends up being arrested. And sometimes whether or not you're successful determines how people approach what it is that what you've done. So there's a concept called 3-person babies. And what this is if you have a damaged mitochondrial DNA, so that if you were to give birth, the baby would have a birth defect that it would die from. They're now looking at ways, it was first approved in the UK, of taking mitochondrial DNA out of someone else's egg and taking yours out, putting that one in there, and then fertilizing the egg, and then having you get pregnant. And I'm only telling you this because it's not legal in the United States at the moment. But the doctor who performed the first one was from the United States, and he flew himself and the patient to Mexico. And that sounds like you should be in a lot of trouble for that, but it was a success. And the funny thing is, success has a tendency, this is my point about you really want your ethics to come first, but sometimes the thing happens and it's successful and then we go, okay, we're fine with it. That's not how we really want to do things. It's much better if we get our ethics out in front and then only, later. So I don't think that White would have gone in that direction. As a matter of fact, he helped set up the Vatican Council of Bioethics, and he was pretty staunch about making sure that when you were talking about human beings and medicine and surgeries and experiments, that you were being highly ethical. The second part of that question was that yes, he did have permission to do that. The monkey head transplant and brain isolation experiments, not only were they sanctioned, they were funded. And he wrote many published papers about it as well. So again, times changed a little bit. I don't know if the same things would be considered okay now. It's hard to say. I don't know of anyone doing them. But at the time, that was absolutely perfectly on the up and up. So.
Okay, and then thank you, Brandy. And by the way, this was a great discussion. Thanks, Chris, for good questions. Another question we had was Dr. White's relationship with the Pope and, his advisory capacity and some of, what were some of the things he advised the Pope about?
Oh, got it. Well, I don't know all of that. What I can tell you are things that Dr. White himself talked about. Because generally speaking, I don't, there was no fly on the wall when he was having his garden chats with the Pope. But I do know, because White reported on it, that he asked the Pope about brain death. So this was very critical, during a critical time before the committee had met and before we had come to sort of legal determinations about brain death. He had asked the Pope, hey, brain death is, real death, right? Like, can you agree that brain death is real death? And the reason he was concerned about this is if you're going to perform a head transplant, you need 3 things. In addition to the permission and funding part, you also need a volunteer and you need a donor. But that donor has to come from someone who is brain dead. So I was mentioning before, brain dead so that you can harvest organs. And so he was basically asking the Pope, because at the time the Catholic Church had not really weighed in on this, is brain death real death? I think it is. I think you should think it is. We should, right? We can agree on this. And apparently the Pope said to him something along the lines of, that's really your job. You're the physician. Physicians are supposed to be the ones with their expertise to advise so that we can make determinations. And White's takeaway was like, it's my job. So he really felt that, the burden had been laid upon him to discover, and to influence these things. So I always like that as a little aside. And he said he felt that maybe he pushed the Pope a little too far on that one. He said he thought maybe the Pope is a little bit like, I don't want to answer this question. So that was just an anecdote that he himself had talked about. But he did help to establish what's called the Vatican Council for Bioethics, which is a body that exists, and they have meetings and they have publications and various things. And he's published there, and he was part of that committee at one point. Yeah.
Do you know how he first came into the Pope's orbit? Was it because of one of those commissions that he was on?
No, it was actually, that was before that, because his first Pope that he met was Pope Paul VI. And I'm trying to remember exactly, this is the trouble with having written a book and it comes out a year later. Uh, but I believe he was teaching a class in Rome to people who were part of the Vatican. And it was regarding things about brain death and other stuff. And Pope Paul VI was pretty involved. He was very interested scientifically, and he'd actually done some edicts, released some papers and some information about how he felt about things that were happening in science. So he invited White to come to a private audience, and White was very excited about that. And I think probably that just sort of moved into the, when the Pope Paul took over. I don't know exactly how or when he met Pope John Paul II, but yeah, he was fascinated and excited and really pleased to have a chance to meet the Pope. And there's lots of photographs with him and the Pope, both Popes, two Popes, he knew two. So.
Brandy, did you get a chance to talk to any of the people who Dr. White taught? Because I think he had a really good reputation as a teacher too.
I muted myself somehow. Okay. Am I good? I'm good. Sorry. Yes, I did. I interviewed a number of his former students and residency doctors and other people who had worked with him, and I got some anecdotes from them. It was just fun. It was fun to kind of, try to put yourself in their shoes. I really wanted you to read the book and feel like you were there. I really wanted you to feel like you had arrived and you were there on the scene. And you really can't get that unless you speak to people who were there, learning from him. One of my favorite anecdotes is a residency doctor dropped a needle during a surgery and it went right through White's shoe into his foot. And he just never stopped operating. He just didn't flinch, but he looked to the residency doctor and he said, "Don't kill the surgeon," and just went right on doing what he was doing. And I mean, there's all sorts of things like that in the book.
And unless anybody has any more questions, there is one more question. And it's about your role with the Medical Humanities Journal, Brandy. I think that must be very fascinating to see probably a lot of proposals come in, and to even as editor to steer some of these discussions. So what are trends that you're seeing right now in medical humanities? What do people want to write about? What do you see as, the larger trends with that?
I'm so glad you asked me that. So at Medical Humanities, we've really focused on social justice, because if you aren't familiar with the medical humanities it's critical medical humanities. So it's the humanities, history, social science, anthropology, disability studies, women's studies, all sorts of things, looking at and having a conversation with medicine. So that also means medical humanities involves papers written by clinicians. So it's a whole mixture of people working together, often as co-authors, to produce this body of work that says, okay, the human is the intersection point of med. I mean, if you're not practicing human-centered medicine, you shouldn't be practicing medicine. So it's a very, very complicated look. It is, in our opinion, the most important place to start looking at social justice and accessibility issues. So our journal has really kind of changed its focus over the last couple of years to be specifically medical humanities and social justice and accessibility. So one of the things I've seen a lot of, and I love it, is articles about, disability rights, articles about LGBTQ rights, articles that say, okay, well, if we're looking at the practice of medicine, how do we make it accessible and equitable for all people? How do we make sure that someone who is not a native English speaker is still getting the same kind of care as somebody who's articulating, better? How do you make sure that, because doctors are often, a lot of that's put on the physicians a lot of the times, and they're not necessarily prepared to deal with all of that. And so how do we fix systemic problems? And how do we make sure that systemic racism isn't affecting the doctors themselves? How do we fix these kinds of things? And then looking beyond the practice of medicine, we look at things like what are social justice calls publicly that can affect public health and policy, that can make this world a safer, healthier, more accessible and equitable place. So I say a lot of the trends that I'm seeing are people picking up on this these calls for papers, this idea of equity, and really running with it. And we're getting papers from clinicians, cardiologists, historians, literature professors, artists. I had a great podcast recently with somebody who's making tech, wearable tech for people with disabilities. And it's cool. It's got scales. It's called Scaled Technology. It'll come, the podcast comes out in April. So, you know, looking at art and design and accessibility, and also looking at, gender and rights. And we had a podcast with Rita Culwell, was the former head of the National Science Foundation and is an amazing figure in her own right. She just wrote a book called A Lab of One's Own, which is all about about sexism in science, and her, fighting against it. So we see a lot of that too. I feel like I'm just talking about books you should all read. You guys should read books. There's so many books. So that's a lot. I love working at the Medical Humanities Journal, and we do have a blog, which is, the journal is of course an academic journal. Some of it is behind a paywall. The blog is not, the podcast is not. It's our public facing venues where we try to cover these concepts of bioethics and history and health.
And if people went to that website, there'd be a link to the blog and the podcast.
Yes. So I believe what happens is you go to our journal website, it takes you to the blog, and the blog takes you to the podcast. And if you just don't want to do any of those things, you can look up my name, and there's a little red flag at the top of my first page that says, go to BMJ. It'll take you there.
Okay. Well, this has been great. Thank you so much for doing this. Thank you, Chris, for doing this. So book is here at MaxBax. Like I said before, if you go to our website, it's maxbax.com. There's a link right on the homepage, and you put in a request for Brandy to sign books for you or anybody who you want the books to be signed for. So thank you so much for all of you who attended, and thank you, Chris, and thank you, Brandy. Brandy, congratulations on another great book.
Thank you so much. It was really great being here. I really appreciated being with everyone. And Chris, great questions. Thank you so much for guiding this discussion and not giving too much away.
Thanks, Brandy. I really love talking with you, and congratulations.
I don't know how to get out.
Just stopping the recording.